Well, good morning and welcome. Let's go ahead and get ourselves started for today. It is Tuesday, May 5th, 2020, and this is our weekly Zoom meeting for Political Science 1, class number 30018. My name is Paul Savoy, and this morning, a few things we're going to go ahead and do after we get through a couple of brief announcements, reminders, that sort of thing. I'll then, first of all, go ahead and ask if there are any questions regarding the subject that we talked about a fair bit during last week's Zoom meeting. That is a little bit about the first of the three national government branches that the framers created in Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution, specifically the U.S. Congress. So we went over some of the highlights in the Congress notes last week that I posted for you on Canvas. And remember, our latest discussion forum post assignment dealing with the U.S. Congress is due this coming Thursday. That's May 7th at 11:59 p.m. So I'll deal with any questions that you might have regarding Congress, stemming from the class notes on Congress, stemming from the crash course videos on Congress, stemming from the assigned readings on Congress, or any questions that you might have about the discussion forum post assignment itself. So stay tuned for that. And then finally, we're going to spend the bulk of our time today previewing the next subject that we'll be dealing with, that will be the subject of your next discussion forum post assignment that will be due a week from this coming Thursday, which would be May 14th. And that is the second of the three national government branches that the framers created, this time in Article 2 of the Constitution, talking a little bit about the presidency. So I'll highlight some of the notes that I posted for you on Canvas yesterday dealing with the presidency, and answer any questions that you have about that. So before we do any of that, again, some announcements and reminders. First of all, if you have turned in your version of test number 2, thank you very much. I appreciate that. I anticipate getting to and grading your test number 2, hopefully sometime tomorrow, and I will get those grades posted up for you on Canvas as soon as I reasonably can. Now, if for some reason you have not yet turned in your version of test number 2, please don't panic, first of all, but please do send me a Canvas message or an email as soon as possible, or come and talk to me tomorrow during my next live Zoom virtual student hours. Again, that will be tomorrow, Wednesday, May 6th, from 2:30 to 3:30 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. And if you want to access tomorrow's virtual student hours, or any of the virtual student hours that I have, again, Monday and Wednesday, 2:30 to 3:30 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time, all you have to do is jump onto the Canvas homepage for this class, scroll down past the picture to where it says basic course information, and you will see both the Zoom link and the password if you want to access those virtual student hours. So again, if you have not yet turned in test number 2, please reach out to me. We'll work out a solution to help ensure your success in this class. So that is pretty much the agenda for today. Also, as a reminder, as always, this weekly Zoom session is being recorded. You can go ahead and watch that recording at any time, all or in part, via the ConferZoom link on our Canvas page for this class. Click on the ConferZoom link, then click on the recordings link once you get there, and then finally click on the link for the day that you want to watch. And if you are prompted for a password to view the recording from this week, just use the password that I sent to you yesterday via Canvas announcement. All right. So before we do anything else, specifically before we go ahead and talk a little bit about any questions that you might have from last week's discussion about the U.S. Congress, are there any questions that you have right now about anything having to do with the class before we go ahead and get started? And as always, throughout today's meeting, if you have a question or a comment, please feel free to unmute your mic and ask. Or if you're more comfortable in doing so, please put your question or comment in the group chat and I'll refer to it from there. So any questions at this point about anything having to do with the class? Anybody? All right, so seeing and hearing none, let's go ahead and get into this. And first of all, as I was saying a few minutes ago, during last week's Zoom get together, I highlighted for you some of the notes dealing with the US Congress. And remember the two main points that I made from last week's discussion of Congress here on Zoom. The first major point was that the framers, when they sat down to create Congress in Article 1 of the Constitution, they saw Congress, they perceived Congress in pretty much the opposite way that we perceive the US Congress today. Specifically, as we said, the framers fervently believed that Congress was potentially the most powerful and the most dangerous of the three national government branches. So in other words, Congress had the greatest potential, much more so than the president or the courts, to become overly powerful, to abuse that power, and to abuse that power in a way that threatens or takes away the people's natural rights. And again, that contrasts dramatically, as we said last week, with how most Americans perceive Congress today. We see Congress as being this rather weak, ineffective, somewhat incompetent, perhaps more than slightly corrupt joke. And we talked last time about how we got from there to here. And we said, really, it's the framers' fault. It is the framers' fault because the framers were so scared of Congress that when they sat down to create the structure and function and process and powers of Congress in Article 1 of the Constitution, they worked very hard to box Congress in. They worked very hard to carefully specify what Congress could and could not do, so that Congress would not spin out of control and abuse people's natural rights. Now, remember what we said. Fortunately and unfortunately, the framers did too good of a job of boxing Congress in. They were overly effective in limiting the power of Congress in Article 1. And that is why today we tend to perceive Congress as being this weak, really rather ineffective joke. The framers were too effective in boxing Congress in. And, related to that, another thing that the framers did that we talked about last time that really has a significant impact on how Congress operates today is the fact that the framers essentially gave Congress too much to do. Now, hopefully, since last Friday, you had a chance to take a look at the biggest part of the notes on Congress, that is Section 4, where I lay out for you in considerable detail, easy for me to say, the 6 basic functions, the 6 major jobs that the framers gave to Congress in Article 1. And remember what we said, the framers essentially gave Congress way too much to do. They gave Congress a lot too much in the way of jobs, right? And we said last week that there was no way that members of Congress, even working full out 24/7, 365, there was no way that they could adequately carry out all 6 of those major functions equally well all of the time. And so we said, because the framers overloaded Congress, today members of Congress have to prioritize their schedules. They have to figure out, of those 6 major jobs that they have available to them in Article 1, which of those jobs do they spend most of their time and their energy and their effort carrying out, right? And so we said that they all have to make trade-offs. They can't do all 6 equally well all of the time. And so the main point that we emphasized from this last week was the fact that virtually every member of Congress today prioritizes the functions that they're going to carry out versus the ones that they're going to ignore based on their reelection obsession. In other words, they will spend most of their time and energy and effort carrying out those congressional functions that will give them the biggest potential boost to their reelection chances. And so if you went through and looked at the notes for Congress in section 4 from last week, you will notice that members of Congress spend most of their time carrying out the first 3 functions that I listed for you there, because those first 3 are the ones that give them the greatest reelection benefit. Unfortunately, though, as we also said last week, members of Congress will not prioritize those congressional functions that either don't help them win re-election or that might actually potentially harm their re-election chances. And if you notice, if you went through again section 4 of the notes, you will notice that because of this, members of Congress spend less time worrying about their oversight function, their conflict resolution function, and even their lawmaking function, which is the main thing that they're supposed to be doing in the first place. So they don't prioritize those 3, and that is potentially very damaging for the country. And notice that the discussion forum post that you're working on for this week, again, due this Thursday at 11:59 p.m., not counting the 3-day grace period, of course, that deals with one of those functions that members of Congress should be doing, should be carrying out for the good of the country all of the time, this oversight function. But most of the time, they don't carry it out because it really doesn't usually have a positive impact on their reelection chances. So that's the stuff that we highlighted last week with regard to Congress. So at this point, are there any questions, comments, reactions about anything having to do with Congress, either from the class notes, from the crash course videos, or from the assigned readings, or from the discussion forum posts? Any questions or comments from dealing with Congress at this time? And you can either open your mic, let me know your question, or if you'd rather go ahead and put your question or your comment in the group chat. So any questions dealing with Congress at this stage? Anyone?
No questions.
Okay, thanks, Reese. Anybody else? And again, if you don't have any questions, you can also, if you have the participant screen up, you can go ahead and click the no button, the red X button, if you want to, or just stay silent. Silence constitutes understanding, I guess. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on. And the main subject that we want to focus on this morning for the remainder of our time is to highlight some of the most important points in the notes that I put up for you on Canvas yesterday. I opened up the module on the presidency and put up the notes for your discussion, your learning on the presidency, as well as the 2 crash course videos that you'll be looking at for the presidency as well. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about this. So if you have your presidency notes from Canvas up in front of you, first thing that you will notice when you take a look at these presidency notes is that I followed pretty much the same format in laying the notes out for the presidency as I did with our earlier discussion, our discussion from last week dealing with the US Congress. So very first thing that you see there in section 1 of the presidency notes is I talk a little bit about the attitude that the framers had regarding the presidency as they were creating it in 1787, this time in Article 2 of the Constitution. And I contrast it with the very different attitude that we have regarding the presidency today in the year 2020. And just like I did with Congress last week, in part 1 of the presidency notes, I talk a little bit about how and why we got from there to here. In other words, why is our contemporary attitude towards the presidency so dramatically different from what the framers thought? And again, just as it was with Congress last week, this time, how we got from there to here is the fault of the framers too. So specifically, if you take a look at point 1 in the presidency notes, what it tells you essentially is that the framers, as they sat down to create the structure, function, powers, and process of the presidency, they really didn't sweat the details with the presidency as they did when they were creating Congress back in Article 1. Why? Because the framers really weren't afraid of the presidency. They really didn't think that the president had the same potential to spin out of control and abuse their powers and threaten people's natural rights in the way that Congress did. Now, that's really interesting, and we'll talk a little bit about why there is that distinction in just a minute. But here's the thing. Remember when we were talking about the framers creating the Constitution generally back at the beginning of the semester, back when we were still face to face in the T building? And remember what we said? We said, that the framers didn't trust people generally. They had this very dismal opinion of human nature, and they were very mistrusting of Congress generally. They really didn't even trust elite folks like themselves to make intelligent, reasonable, unemotional political choices. So you can see, why the framers didn't trust Congress and why the framers took all the steps that they did to box Congress in. But you might wonder, well, okay, fine, but why didn't they trust the president? Why did they trust the presidency so much more? And there's a number of reasons for this. And one of the reasons sounds kind of silly when we first talk about it, but it does make some sense when you think about it in some detail. The framers, for a variety of reasons, as they sat down to create the presidency, realized, or at least they assumed, most of them assumed, that the likely first president of the United States would be George Washington. And for whatever reason, and we will talk a little bit about this in a minute, the framers assumed that all presidents of the United States would be similar to George Washington. And this is one of the main reasons why, and I know this sounds weird, but this is one of the main reasons why the framers didn't feel the need to really sweat the details and to clearly specify what presidents could do and couldn't do in Article 2 in the same way that they did with Article 1. And if you do a comparison between the two, if you put a copy of Article 1 of the Constitution side by side with a copy of Article 2, what you will notice right away is that Article 2 is much shorter and much more vague than Article 1. So the framers just didn't sweat Article 2 much at all. Why? They didn't fear the presidency because they were assuming that most presidents in the United States would be like George Washington. Now, why was this? Well, obviously, at the time that he was elected president for the first time in 1789, George Washington was by far the most popular, the most well-regarded, the most beloved and trusted person in the United States. And that was even true as he was ending his second term as president. Now, we talked about this earlier in the semester, that Washington could have run for re-election as president as many times as he wanted to, because there was no term limit for the presidency originally in the Constitution. The framers knew nothing about term limits. It wasn't anything that was on their radar at all. So if Washington had decided that he was going to run for a third term, a fourth term, a fifth term as president, chances are he would have been successful. He really could have been president for life, which is what Alexander Hamilton wanted, right? That's just how highly regarded, how beloved George Washington was, not just amongst the framers, but amongst the American people in general and American voters in particular, right? Washington was seen as this incredibly honest person with incredible integrity, incredible love of country, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Was he perfect? Well, of course not. Washington had his own number of failures throughout his life and his political career, his military career too, early on. But despite that, he was just seen as being this larger than life hero in the United States. And for whatever reason, the framers assumed that all subsequent American presidents would be similar to that. And that's strange. And you might wonder why that is. There's a number of possible reasons. One that makes some sense to me is the fact that since the framers went through all that struggle and argument and debate over creating the electoral college, over creating this really tough selection process for the presidency, I think that the framers assumed that any presidential candidate that could successfully get through the electoral college system and actually be elected president would have a lot going for them. So that this selection process that they created for the presidency would be an excellent filter and would filter out, would eliminate from consideration folks that would not be a good president. Well, the framers, they had big egos. They were pretty confident about their abilities. And I think that's one factor that explains the fact that they just assumed that all presidents would be good presidents, honest presidents, presidents with a lot of integrity. So they didn't see the need to put the same limitations on the presidency, to put the same detail in Article 2 as they did with Congress in Article 1. So does that make sense to this point? Any questions, comments, problems, etc., about anything that we've said so far about the presidency? And again, you can open up your mics, ask a question, make a comment, or put your question or comment in the group chat. Anything so far dealing with the presidency?
I have one. So,
Sure.
like once we started realizing that like the presidents are not all the same, why didn't they get together, or like a group of people get together and be like, oh, maybe we should change this?
Well, again, we come back to the fundamental difficulty of amending the U.S. Constitution.
Right.
And, again, we've only amended the Constitution. Remember, the framers themselves, they put in the first 10 amendments, what we know as the Bill of Rights. And they did that in the couple of years after the Constitution was first ratified in 1789. So, here's the thing. We've only gone through, people other than the framers have only gone through and amended the Constitution 17 times in almost 250 years. So we know how difficult that is to do. And I think, related to that, the Electoral College has changed from the original version that we talked about at the beginning of the semester. Remember what we said. The Electoral College slowly evolved very organically. There was no formal change in the Constitution, but how the Electoral College functioned began to slowly evolve into the really weird system that we have today. And so I guess that, I guess that to this point in our history, we haven't had a president that was so seen universally as being so bad for the country, so incompetent or so crooked or so self-interested or whatever, that enough of us could rise up, that we could get majorities in both houses of Congress to put an amendment out there to change the method of presidential selection, or to call a constitutional convention that could, among other things, propose a change in presidential selection. So that's part of it. And I think another related part of it too, is the fact that I think that, neither party, whether Democrats or Republicans, would be particularly eager to radically change the method of presidential selection, simply because they're really experienced. They're really used to dealing with presidential elections and election campaigns using the format that we have now. They're comfortable with that format. They're largely comfortable in their ability to work the system to get candidates from their party elected. And so, if change is going to have to start with political insiders, if an amendment will normally begin through a vote by both houses of Congress, neither party is going to be able to get the votes up to amend the process. I mean, even right now, even if Democrats had majorities in both houses of Congress, which they don't, right? They control a majority in the House, but not the Senate. But even if they had majorities in both houses of Congress, and despite the incredible hatred that most Democrats have over our current resident of the White House, Donald J. Trump, a Republican, right? That would probably still not be enough for Democrats to be able to muster enough support amongst their ranks in both houses of Congress to amend the Constitution and change the process for selecting a president. Why? Because this is the process that they're used to. And if they change the system, it might disadvantage Republicans in the future, but it might also disadvantage Democrats in the future. And so they're much more comfortable with maintaining the status quo, even if they don't particularly like what the status quo gives us from time to time. So does that make sense? Any other questions or comments related to that, or anything else dealing with our discussion of the presidency so far? Anyone? Okay, so that's the thing, right? Because the framers didn't fear the presidency, the framers did not sweat the details in Article 2. So Article 2 only vaguely discusses the structure, function, process, and powers of the presidency. That's how we got from there to here. Because remember what we said. We said that today, when we do public opinion surveys of Americans, the vast majority of Americans by far say, hands down, without a doubt, the president is the most powerful and potentially dangerous of the three national government branches. So a big change from what the framers thought. And how did we get from there to here? Well, it's the framers' fault, right? Because the framers didn't put a lot of detail into Article 2 about what presidents could and could not do, as it says in your notes, modern presidents have been able to exploit, they've been able to take advantage of that lack of detail in Article 2 to dramatically expand the powers available to them as president. And I lay this out for you in more detail as you go further in the presidency notes. Modern presidents from both parties, pretty much without exception, well, maybe with the exception of Jimmy Carter, the Democrat between 76 and 1980, he really wasn't all that power hungry. But every other modern president, Republican or Democrat, starting with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR in the 1930s, and leading all the way up to the current resident of the White House, Donald J. Trump, every one of them has taken intentional steps to dramatically increase their levels of power and authority. And most often, not always, but most often they are able to get away with doing this. How and why? Well, it's really simple. They are able to take advantage of the lack of detail in Article 2. And, in the last section of the notes where I go over the 5 basic powers, the 5 basic jobs of the presidency in some detail, what you will notice is that within a couple of those powers, particularly within, well, actually 3 that come to mind, the role of the president as chief executive, the role of the president as chief diplomat, and the role of the president as commander-in-chief of the armed forces. In all 3 of those areas, modern presidents have dramatically increased their power, in part by inventing new power for themselves in each of those areas. How can they get away with doing this a lot of the time? Because Article 2 isn't clear. It isn't specific about what presidents can and cannot do. So if a president attempts to invent a new power for themselves and someone challenges it, maybe members of Congress challenge it or the courts challenge it, or the American people themselves challenge it and they say, hey, Mr. President, you can't do that. You can't create that new power for yourself. Article 2 doesn't say that you can do that thing, whatever it is. And the president can reply, well, yeah, sure. Article 2, excuse me, doesn't say that I can do this thing, but it also doesn't say that I can't do this thing. So it is that intentional lack of detail in Article 2 that got us from there to here, that got us to where today most people say that the president is too powerful and that makes the president potentially very dangerous. Okay? So does that make sense? Does everybody understand how and why we got from there to here in terms of our changing perception of the power of the presidency? Questions or comments? Again, unmute your mic or put them in the group chat. Anybody? Does that make sense to us? So far, so good? Yeah?
Yep.
Okay. Oh, go ahead. Oh,
I
good.
was
Yeah.
just saying,
Okay.
I understand.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I appreciate the affirmation. So, one other really important element of the notes that I want to emphasize with you today is in section 2. And if you look at section 2 of the presidency notes, it is really brief, right? It is the shortest section. Well, actually, it is a little bit longer than section 3, but it is pretty brief. But don't let the lack of length in section 2 fool you. That is a really, really crucial point that I make in point 2, helping us understand how presidents in general get their job done. Because here's the thing. At this point in U.S. history, we have had 45 presidents under the U.S. Constitution, starting with George Washington, our first president, and leading up to our current president, number 45, Donald J. Trump, right? Now, over time, a lot of folks, a lot of political scientists, a lot of constitutional historians, a lot of journalists, and just a lot of ordinary folks who are obsessed with the presidency and the history of the presidency, a lot of folks have created these ranked lists, right? They have ranked American presidents from top to bottom in terms of their success, in terms of their effectiveness as president. There's all these lists out there. If you Google them, you can find a lot of examples of these, right? And what these lists will tell you, if you look at them, though they don't always agree, especially in the detail, but what these lists will tell you is that over 230 plus years, we've had a few very successful, very effective presidents, right? We've had a lot of presidents that are, okay, so, not great, not terrible. They're fine, whatever, right? And we also have a few presidents that are considered to be very unsuccessful and potentially very dangerous. One more recent example that comes to mind is Richard Nixon, who was president from 1968 until 1974. He was forced to resign from the presidency during his second term in office. He wanted to avoid being the first president that was officially removed from office through the impeachment process. What was his deal? Well, he broke a lot of laws as president. He got caught up in this scandal called the Watergate scandal. And very famously, when asked about this, President Nixon said on national television, well, if the president does something, then it is not illegal. So the president basically said, well, I have absolute power. I can do whatever I want to. Because if I take an action, it might be illegal for everybody else in society to do it, but it's not illegal for me. Well, that didn't wash with Congress. That didn't wash with the American people. And he, basically had to resign from the presidency and was disgraced pretty much for the remainder of his life. So we have a few great presidents, a whole lot of so-so presidents, and a few presidents that really aren't considered to be all that wonderful, that are kind of considered to be pretty bad in our history. Now, in all of this, with all of these ranked lists, a lot of people have written about this. A lot of people have tried to figure out what are the factors that explain why some American presidents have been so much more successful and more effective than other American presidents. And there's all this stuff written about this over time, over the last like 80 or 100 years. Taken together, all this stuff that was written about the presidency constitutes what we call the presidential success literature. And there's a lot of it. And I've read most of it. I've read most of the presidential success literature essentially so you don't have to. And the reason why I say that is because most of what is listed in the presidential success literature is pretty much a lot of junk, okay? Stuff that's not very useful, not really worth the paper that it's printed on, okay? But on the other hand, if you sift through all of this presidential success literature, you will start seeing one common point that keeps coming up again and again and again in a significant number of these studies, of these analyses of what makes some presidents better and more successful than others. And I talk about that common thread in section 2 of your presidency notes. Look what it says there. Basically, what it says is that while there are a lot of different factors, a lot of varying factors over time that can cause some presidents to be more successful than others, one common thread that we should pay close attention to is that the most successful presidents in US history have tended to be those presidents who were able to build and maintain high levels of public support. So in other words, publicly popular presidents, and try saying that 3 times fast, right? Publicly popular presidents tend to get more done and be more successful than presidents that have lower levels of public support, lower levels of public popularity. And that is the most important key to understanding presidential success or lack of success. And let's spend a couple of minutes talking about why that is, because it is kind of an intriguing issue. At first, you might not be able to see, well, why is it that more popular presidents tend to be more successful? Well, look what it says in section 2. And what it tells you there is that some of the most successful presidents have been those that were initially met with a lot of opposition by the US Congress. And this is a key point, because here's the thing. If a president is going to get things done, if a president is going to be able to successfully implement their agenda for the country, if the president wants to create new programs, new laws, new rules and regulations that help to try and solve major problems that we're facing in the country, most of the time, presidents can't do that alone. Because remember, most of all, the president is supposed to be the chief law enforcer of the United States, the chief executive, the person that implements national government laws and policies and programs and stuff like that. The president, under separation of powers, is not supposed to be making laws, programs, and policies. Who does that? Well, that's the job of Congress, right? And so what we figured out over time is that in our separation of powers system, if a president is going to be successful and effective in implementing his agenda for the country, the president needs significant cooperation by Congress. Congress needs to be able to give the president the laws, policies, programs, rules, and regulations that that president needs to implement their agenda. Now, if you're a president that has huge and universal support amongst members of Congress, no problem. It's easy for you to get Congress to do what you want them to do. So, for example, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, starting in the 1930s, right? He had great success in getting Congress to create the laws, policies, programs, et cetera, needed to get us out of the Great Depression, all those New Deal programs. Now, he had an easy time doing this for the most part because both houses of Congress at the time were controlled by the Democratic Party. They had large majorities in both houses of Congress, and FDR himself was a Democrat, right? Now, he did have to cut a rather distasteful deal with Southern Democrats, conservative Democrats, to get a lot of his agenda done, which really slowed down civil rights protections for African Americans by about 40 years, but that's another story for another class, right? So if your party controls Congress as president, you're probably going to have a fairly easy time getting Congress to implement your agenda. But what if your party does not control Congress? How do you get things done? How do you get an otherwise hostile Congress to do what you want them to do? Well, that's where having a high level of public popularity and support as president comes in. Because as it says there in point 2, okay, that the high level of public support that you have can be used as leverage to force Congress to do what the president wants them to do. Why? Remember the re-election obsession, right? If you have a very publicly popular president and Congress won't do what that president wants, that president can kind of force Congress into assisting him. How? By going to the American people directly and saying to the American people, hey, you all know me. You generally like me. You support what I'm trying to do to help the country. But guess what, American people? Guess what, American voters? Some of your elected representatives in Congress are opposing me. Some of your members of Congress are refusing to implement my agenda to help the country, to improve your quality of life. So what I want you to do, American voters, is to contact your member of Congress and tell your member of Congress to support the president on this law, that program, etc. And tell them if they don't support the president on these issues that are of vital concern to you, that you will not vote for them in the next election. And because members of Congress are obsessed with re-election, if a president's very popular, they're going to do what that president wants them to do. Great example of that was Bill Clinton, who was president for 2 terms in the 1990s. He was president from 1992 until 2000. Now, Bill Clinton, former governor of, oh gosh, I just blanked. Former governor of a southern state. He'd be so upset if he knew I forgot, like he cares. But anyway, former Southern Governor Bill Clinton, Arkansas. There we go. Thank you very much. My memory finally kicked in. Bill Clinton was a Democrat, but during his presidency, both houses of Congress pretty much were controlled by the Republican Party, and the Republican Party hated Bill Clinton, and they hated his wife, the First Lady, Hillary Clinton, probably even more. So you would think that with a hostile Republican majority in both houses of Congress, that Bill Clinton would have gotten absolutely nothing done as president. And that's not true. He got a lot of stuff done. Even after the Republicans in Congress tried to remove him from office through the impeachment process, he still got things done. Why? Because even after Congress tried to throw Clinton out of office and they were unsuccessful, a large majority of Americans, about 65% of Americans, still liked Bill Clinton, still thought he was doing a good job. And Clinton was able to leverage his public popularity to get the hostile Republicans in Congress to do what he wanted them to do. And that's why presidential popularity, high levels of public support, is so crucial for presidential success. Does that make sense? questions about that, comments, either open up your mic or put them in the group chat. Are we good with this stuff? Okay, so we are at 11:45. Time flies when you're having fun, or at least it does for me. So I'm going to wrap things up for this week. Now, remember, first of all, and some of you were not here at the very start of today's meeting, so let me just remind you, if you have already submitted test number 2 to me via Canvas, I'm going to be working on grading those starting tomorrow. So be looking for those grades in the next few days. And I apologize for the delay. Lots going on. Stay tuned for that. If you have not yet submitted your version of test number 2 to me via Canvas, please ASAP send me a Canvas message or an email, or see me during my virtual student hours tomorrow afternoon on Zoom. Talk to me. Let's work out a solution so you can get your test submitted to me as soon as you reasonably can and get some credit for it, because I want you to be successful in this class, right? Also remember, our next discussion forum post assignment is due this coming Thursday. That is May 7th at 11:59 p.m., not counting, of course, the 3-day grace period that you have to get that turned in, dealing with the U.S. Congress. So make sure that you submit that at some point over the next few days before the end of the grace period, if at all possible. And then finally, next week, during our regular weekly get together from 11 to 11:45 a.m. Pacific Daylight Time on Tuesdays, I'll first of all be taking any questions that you have about the presidency that we talked about a bit today. And then I will highlight the notes for you for the next discussion that we're going to have, the next section that you'll be learning about, dealing with the third national government branch, the court system, the judicial branch, the folks who are responsible for interpreting national government laws. So between now and then, please feel free to reach out to me for anything that you think I can assist you with, whether it has to do with this class or even if it has nothing to do with LBCC at all. Remember, my main goal is your success, not just in this class, but in life. I am always here for you. As we go through this extraordinary situation that the whole world is experiencing at this time, please know you are not alone. I am always here for you. I've always got your back, and I'm here to help however I can. So until next time, be safe, take care, and know I'm here for you. We've got this. We're going to be successful. Thanks for joining me today, and I'll talk to you all soon. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Have a good week.
You too. Take care.